we're looking at today. We're here with Steve Bashore, who is the master distiller over at Mount Vernon. He is one of the masterminds behind this nifty bottle here. Obviously, a lot of you who brush up on your whiskey history know Mount Vernon as George Washington's estate. He had a distillery up there where he distilled and after his death distilled rum and whiskey. And so really these bottles are kind of a drinkable part of history, which is really cool. So Steve, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do at the distillery, and we'll take it from there.
Well, Greg, thanks for having me. Yeah, I run the historic trades department at Mount Vernon, so we are a museum and a site that educates people as well as that we do production. So my department is in charge of the grist mill, the water-powered mill, the distillery, both of which are reconstructions based on archaeology and research. So they're very accurate to what Washington had in the late 1790s. And then I also manage the farm. We have a demonstrational farm and we have a blacksmith shop. So I have a team of people under me that basically does what we call living history. We dress in period clothes. We do the work that was done on the estate in the 18th century. And over the years with the distillery, when it was opened in 2007, we've been ramping up that program, and it's become a pretty popular whiskey and I think a high quality whiskey. We also make brandy, as Washington did. And you mentioned rum. We did make one batch of rum a couple of years ago. So over that last 10 to 12 years, we've branched out from just rye, but try to stay in the history zone. You know, we don't want to go too far afield of what was done there in the 18th century. But for Washington, it was a huge business. Right after the presidency got into it, and has a Scottish influence there too, because he had a Scottish farm manager whose idea it was to get into distilling. So we tell that story there every day too, which is, you know, part of relating the history of early distilling in America.
Well, that's excellent. So, I mean, a lot of people, George Washington, a lot of people don't realize played such an integral part in, whiskey's roots in American history, from bringing whiskey in the Revolution when rum wares got down, all the way to being the first and last president to lead a battalion into war with the Whiskey Rebellion. So tell us a little bit about, really what it's like working with all of that history, not just, just being in it, being around it, and what's it like actually recreating a recipe from such an integral figure in history, not just American history, but whiskey history.
It's been a fascinating ride because, you know, most people think of Washington as the statesman or, you know, the commander in chief, but he was an incredible entrepreneur. And so the distillery really illustrates that. So what has been fun is we have the distillery ledgers. We have a lot of correspondence, so we can read his actual words about what went on there. And that gave us a good grounding in the story of how it was built. And looking through the ledger, our research team was able to determine the mash bill because it wasn't written down somewhere, but they had the entries for grain leaving the mill and going next door to the distillery. And they were able to break out those ratios to get us about a 55 to 60% rye, around 30% corn, and the rest malted barley. So within those documents, you see stories. You sometimes have to read between the lines, but that's one side of it. The second part of it was when we started making it and rowing mash by hand. It was a learning curve, you know, because there are some manuals from the 18th century, but sometimes you read them and you're not really sure what they're saying. And then you get into the act of rowing or setting mash in a wooden fermenter or running a wood-fired still. We had that curve to get over, and over time we've discovered little secrets about how they did it. Some of it wasn't written down, but occasionally you'll look back into one of those old texts and you'll go, hey, that's what we do. It was almost reverse engineering. You know, we figured some things out and then we got it confirmed by a text from 1767. So that's been a fun part, is just as, you know, getting down into the nerdy part of the history is to dig into the text and then and be able to put that into action in the distillery. So basically we ferment in wood barrels, 120 gallon hogsheads. We use wooden rakes to row mash, and that all goes through 5 copper pot stills. We double everything. So it's batch distillation. You got to get the mash in, drain the still, and go back at it another day. So a lot of manual labor, man. It's you understand why they invented pumps and pipes. And
yeah, so I mean, this has got to be really, really before a lot of those column stills were implemented and
oh
things
yeah,
were made easier for distillers. Guys are doing it all the old fashioned way. This is old fashioned whiskey, not just in name, but really in practice.
yeah, it's way before the column still or the coffee still. And the key person, really, as I mentioned, was he hired this gentleman, James Anderson, who was from Inverkeithing and had been involved in industrial milling and distilling. So I say on tour often, if Washington had not hired Anderson, the distillery would have probably never happened, because he had an expert there to help design it, build it, and he and his son, along with a paid assistant distiller and 6 young enslaved men, worked that distillery. And the amazing thing is, in 1798, the first year it ran, they produced 4,500 gallons of whiskey.
Really?
1799, the last year of Washington's life, they produced 10,942 gallons of rye whiskey. Yeah, almost 11,000 working by hand. And so we make about 1,400 proof gallons a year. And after a run, we're about dead. It's tough. And I think of those guys. Yeah, those guys just turning it over, month after month. So it was highly productive, highly profitable. And keep in mind that they didn't age whiskey in the 18th century. So the profit was immediate. And that was the other thing Washington liked. He could send it into Alexandria, Virginia, 9 miles down the road, and the cash came right back the next day.
Yeah, because it wasn't until closer to the mid 1800s that people started aging whiskey in practice.
Yeah, really, 18 teens, late 18 teens, 1821. You can see references to that. Now, they knew aging in the 18th century because you could buy aged brandy in Europe. And Washington also got a gift of 28-year-old rum once. And the guy sent him this barrel, and he called, in the letter, the guy called it the Heart of Oak. And in the letter Washington wrote back thanking him, you could tell Washington understood the value of that spirit. So it was just something, though, that on the common market, the regular person couldn't afford to wait or pay the price of aged spirit. And so the American market was a quick turnaround. So we make an unaged rye too. I know you have some of our rye there that's aged, but we always do a little unaged because we want to be true to what was done back then. And then we barrel age and have a straight rye. And then we have our premium, which you have, which is a little over 4 years. And, along the way, I just want to mention too, we're historians, and I come at this from grain. I've been a historic miller running water mills for 27 years. And so I knew a lot about grain, but when I got to Mount Vernon 14 years ago, the distillery was just being completed. And so I got in on the ground floor, and we had a lot of master distillers come over the years to do projects with us, including Jimmy Russell, Dave Pickrell, Chris Morris of Woodford Reserve.
I got to meet Chris. Chris was a cool guy.
and Joe Dangler, who used to make Virginia Gentleman for 30 plus years. And a lot of craft guys too. We worked with Ted Huber at a Starlight Distillery, and Thomas McKenzie, who's independent now, but for a long time he was at Finger Lakes Distilling up in New York. So it brings people together like whiskey does, it brings friends together. And so we've been able to do these interesting projects and learn from these distillers. And it's been a good ride because along the way we improve. And the hard thing for us sometimes is one distiller will say, you have to do it this way. And then the next consultant will say, well, you don't want to do that. And so part of my job is being in the middle, deciding what's going to work for us, based on their good advice. And, Dave, I don't know if you met Dave, but a lot of funny stories with Dave over the years. And he helped us along the way in all the early years. And then in 2016, he was really busy with a lot of his, he did so much work with the craft world that he started to phase out. And then Lisa Wicker, who's our current consultant, kind of came into the picture, and she runs Widow Jane in Brooklyn now. So she's been a great help too. So not only is it the history for us, it's kind of dual in that I jokingly say I most of the time live in the 18th century, but I also get to work with these great people who instruct us and help us, and we learn from. So it's been a great project all the way around.
So what exactly, what brought you into the historic whiskey scene? Because that seems like such a niche, like being a historic distiller. That's not something that people hear often, or really. It's just, this is kind of the first time that I've been experienced to a historic distiller at a historic place trying to emulate exactly what the ground level of whiskey was, way back in the day, way back in the 1800s. What's that like? How do you get into historic distilling?
Well, like a lot of things in life, if you ever seen that drawing where they say like a linear graph, your life will go like this. Most of our lives go like this. We're, we're in and out of different things. And so I was totally into milling. I mean, that was my passion. It's still my passion, running water powered mills. And because of that experience and skill, Mount Vernon thankfully hired me when they were going to build the distillery. And so I got lucky is what happened. I knew a little bit about distilling. I enjoyed whiskey, but the practical application of it, I didn't understand fully. So short answer is I got fortunate. I was fortunate that I got the job. Others had applied. They selected me. I started in January 2007. March of that year, we opened the distillery, and I got to distill with all those master distillers. And so I get in on the ground floor, and it's just been building year after year. And I think really the last 5 or 6, 7 years, I can feel in me some of my skill sets just improving, and I understand it so much better now. And my team is really good. I got a core of really good people that can run stills like this. So it's not all Steve doing all this. I got, men and women that work for me that have gotten pretty proficient at doing this. And so, I just think I was at the right place at the right time. And because there's not many historic distilleries out there, Locust Grove in Louisville, Kentucky is a historic site that has one still that they've got all the research on, and Vendome built them a still, and they do small batch distillation there. Brian Cushing is the guy that does that there. But really, all the existing historical distilleries are long gone. But like any industry, technology changed, things progressed, people moved into the 19th century. And so the way we do it is really kind of a hidden gem in the industry, I'd call it.
Yeah, and it's funny you say Vendome, man. When I first went to Kentucky, I just did not realize the borderline monopoly that they run on the still market up there. Almost everyone's got a Vendome. It's crazy.
They do great work. Mike Sherman, they made the stills for us, and they made our boiler and the worms. And so Mike, in fact, was at Mount Vernon just a week and a half ago, because they come out periodically to inspect, because we've got direct wood fire hitting the bottom of a copper pot. And so obviously I want to make sure that copper is not thinning out for obvious reasons. So Mike's been a great partner, and he's helped with a couple of the early distillation projects as well. So, but again, like as I said to you, I think if you love whiskey, part of what we love about it is people we get together with.
Yep.
These days we have to do it this way, a lot of the times, but the site at Mount Vernon has brought together so many different people from different types of distillation backgrounds or history backgrounds, and we work together. Because I have other historians from other places, friends of mine in England, that come occasionally and help us make whiskey too, because they love it. So that's been, I think, one of the funner things for me is just the camaraderie. It's not a bad place to sit there in that old building and row mash.
Yeah. So if somebody were to go visit Mount Vernon, are they able to see the distillery if they're going to check the other stuff, or do you guys do distillery tours? Are they able to walk into like a little entryway and see what you guys are doing? How would somebody be able to see what you guys do?
Well, normally, because of the way we produce and running wood fires, we don't do regular tours during production. It's a small distilling room. I mean, it's big for the time period, but we occasionally will do a VIP package tour for 10 to 12 people to come through for 2 hours, and we'll run the mill for them. We'll show them how we set mash. They get to see that happen and the stills run. And then we do a tasting with them upstairs. But with COVID, everything's different right now. So we'll probably offer that when things are better. But in a normal year for the visitor, if you come to Mount Vernon, the estate, the house, is open 365 days a year. The mill and distillery are open April through October. That's our tour season.
Got it.
So occasionally in season, we'll do a small brandy run, and that we only run 3 stills or 2 stills. So then we can bring tours in and people can see what we're doing and just kind of be on one side of the room while we run. But it's about safety, really. As you know, in distilleries, things are dangerous places. And so we just can't run big tours while we're running 5 stills. So
have you ever had any of those like VIP tours, or anybody come in? Do you do tastings every now and again in the
Yeah, we do. We've done in fact in September last, it was Spirits Month in Virginia, so all the spirits were discounted, And we set up a tent outside in front of the distillery, so we had the right spacing. And we did tastings every Saturday afternoon, and those sold out. That was really, popular. And it also drove a lot of sales. People want to taste the product, and then they'll go purchase the product.
So were you, have you ever had anybody that's like come to one of these tastings or one of these VIP tours and just not really been a whiskey person and just had that aha moment where they see everything that goes into it? Because I remember, man, I was really into whiskey and I thought I was a big fan. And then when I went to Kentucky for the first time and looked at my first mash tank and barrel, they let me over at Michter's, they let me fill a barrel and sign it. And it was the second that I did all of that and I looked at the mash tank and saw everything that went into it and watched them, run a still. I mean, that was it. I pivoted hard into doing these reviews and what I do. I mean, I thought I was into whiskey, but that was a click moment for me. Have you ever seen any of those click moments for people?
Oh yeah, definitely. And we see that in a variety of ways because number one, when you enter historic reconstruction like that, it's for many people, they've never seen anything like it. So you've already got your audience, because they're in there. It's all wooden beams, copper pots, brick fireboxes, cobblestone mash floor, so you can see it on their faces. And then once they understand the process a little better, it really, you can tell people leave there and they want to get into whiskey more, learn more about it. The grist mill also blows them away because if you've never seen a water wheel driven mill run, you can see their eyeballs, pop out. And occasionally, some people, as we all know, we love whiskey, but there are people that don't like whiskey. And I've done tastings where, the unaged whiskey in particular, people will say, oh, I don't like that. And it's like, I'll say, well, what whiskey do you drink? And then they say, well, I don't like whiskey. And I go, well, I don't know what your baseline is then, but I think our job is to be ambassadors, not just of the spirits that we make, but also the story intrigues them. If you like history at all, and some people are just, you look at the visitors and there's some people that really know it and some just are coming for an enjoyable day. But I think they connect with Washington as the farmer and businessman more than some do maybe as a general or as the president even. Those are things you learn in school. But they love learning that, oh, wow, he had an 8,000 acre property and he, had a whiskey distillery. And then you've already got them right there in the palm of your hands. So that's part of what we do real well at Mount Vernon is reaching people, all types of people. And that's one of the fun things because, if you like storytelling, and we've got the best stories to tell.
Do you ever do the palm trick where you put the whiskey on the palm and you have them rub it for a minute and smell, and then rub it some more and it gives you the grain, you rub it some more and it gives you the yeast smell?
Yeah, I've done some of that. Yeah.
And that's the thing. Whenever I have somebody that's like, I don't really know about whiskey, I don't know anything about whiskey, I'm not that interested in whiskey, but they humor you, when you show them the palm trick, I've noticed that for some reason, that specific thing just sinks so many people. They'll start asking questions. How does that happen? Why does it happen? I don't know why. I've seen some people that are just like, nah, and then you show them that and they're like, whoa.
Yeah, you're reaching them there. You're connecting them to it. And so, yeah, there's a lot of different ways we connect. Again, we're fortunate in that because of the location we're in, you're already like 40% ahead in trying to impress somebody about whiskey because you've got this incredible building behind you. And
that's a good point.
we're in period costume. So as an interpreter, historical interpreter, people approach you and they already see, okay, 18th century costume. Look at this stone building. So all these are advantageous to us as we bring them into the story. And hopefully we transport them back in time. They learn something about George Washington. They learn about the people that lived and worked there. And then when they leave, they have a basic understanding what fermentation distillation is, because the science doesn't change. The methods of setting that mash, we're showing the early method. So, I've been very fortunate because it's an easy story to tell. You got whiskey, you had George Washington. It's a good story to tell.
Well, excellent, man. Let's dive in a little bit to the whiskey before we've got time. But one of the things that hit me about it instantly, man, is it's got such a sweet nose for a rye, and I'm used to there being earthy, and I'll say this a million times when it comes to rye whiskeys. To me, there are really three kinds of whiskeys. There's the At least when I first started drinking whiskey, I felt that there was the earthy rye, the spiced rye, and that funky rye. But the more I get into rye whiskeys, I'm starting to feel like there's a fourth one, which is almost like a sweet rye. And this one kind of hits that sweet rye right on the nose, which kind of blew me away, because it's, when you get that rye, you expect there to be more of that bold, that bold rye, spicy, earthy type of downy note to it. And this one just got, it's got, you can definitely have that earthy rye, a little bit of funk on the back end of the nose, which is great. Right. I love the funky ryes. But on the front end, it's like crisp and light, and a little floral, a little honey, and a little caramel. It's way sweeter than I would expect, which is really cool. Is there something in the mash bill that gives it that sweet profile?
I think it's the high corn content, frankly. You're looking at about 31% corn.
That makes sense.
And so, and to me, sometimes I even get a slight creamy note to it.
Yeah, almost like a caramel cream.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting. So this is like a rye for bourbon drinkers.
It's got that aspect to it, and what people get up front too on when you take your first sip is, like all ryes, there's that pepper that hits people. And I think when people first try it at the tastings, if they've never had rye, they're thinking that black pepper allspice is going to continue all the way. And what happens is on the finish, that recedes and more of the corn again comes out on the finish. You get a sweeter finish and a mellower finish than you'd anticipate.
It's interesting because it almost hits you like a wave. Like on the front, I wouldn't even say it's like black peppercorn, which you get a lot with ryes. It's almost like a pink peppercorn, where it's got a little bit more of that floral pepper aspect to it, which is really nice.
And if you could compare it to the 2-year-old, you would get more of a traditional rye hit you in that. And what the term I like to use for our 4-year-old is a little more time in the barrel has rounded off some of those rye edges.
Yeah.
So as it goes to mid palate too, when it finishes, people are surprised the smoothness of it.
And it's interesting too. When I look at ryes, usually you'll get a pretty good char note at the end of it, and you can taste a thin amount of that barrel char. But it's interesting how bold some of the flavors that would normally be a little bit more subtle are. So at the end there, you get that almost that like corn, that toasted corn kernel.
Mm-hmm.
You get that thin line of that barrel char, but then you get almost like a vanilla spice and like a winter, almost like a muddling spice.
Do you pick up any, and not every batch has this, but do you get any hint? You might mistake it for a tannin, but any smoke? And it's very light. And again, not every batch, because every batch is a little different, but
kind of right in the end of the middle, almost like right before the finish hits. I get a very, very light smoky flavor to it, almost like a smoke, like a smoked wood chip, but less intense.
And what that comes from, which is unique to our building, is while we're collecting, as the stills run, 5 wood fires are running. So the whiskey gets brought to the proofing table. We check it periodically, goes into a temporary storage tank. And so in the air is wood smoke. And so that's, you talk about terroir and whiskey, not just the land the grain comes from, but the building itself. That's an aspect of our whiskey that's unique, and others don't have that. Because somebody asked me if there was peated malt in there once. I said, no peat. It's all, the place.
Yeah, it's definitely a different note. I mean, I have a couple scotches that I'll dive into once I get through the sea of bourbon and reviews that I have to do. I'll dive into a little bit of scotch here and there, especially when I'm out grilling or something. I really like the aesthetic of that. But you definitely get that peat flavor, and that smoke that you're talking about is definitely not that. It's like a very, very, like, I don't know if you've ever put out a campfire while the wood wasn't all the way ashed, like you put the campfire out, and then maybe 15 minutes later, you can still smell that very faint wisp of campfire scent in the air, but it's almost like you would just not be able to detect it if you weren't actively noticing it. And that's kind of what I get there, which is really cool, honestly.
Yeah, I think
It's interesting that there's such subtle flavors there, especially in a rye, which is notorious for being big and bold. There's such subtle flavors that are able to still peek through that rye note. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, it's a good way to describe it. The firewood, his analogy works. So again, the uniqueness of the methods and the way the stills are run really lend that extra note in there for us. Now, early on, we learned a lot about fermentation over the years too. So, I could have poured you an early unaged batch that, honestly, I can say now, you call them the humble bottles, that wasn't on the spectrum of where we'd want it to be. But now, even our unaged, it's a really clean distillation. It's really well fermented. And so, people are often surprised because sometimes we'll do a comparison tasting and I'll say, well, look, maybe you've never had an unaged whiskey. Don't be afraid of it. It's not moonshine. It's a rye. It just never hit a barrel. So taste this. And some people are so pleasantly surprised. I've even had people like the unaged better than the 2-year-old. Everybody's a little different on their palate. And so, but I try to coax them into it because I want them to see the base spirit and then what the barrel does to it over time. And having the unaged as one of our product lines gives us a nice tasting opportunity that way.
I've really noticed as I go into Kentucky more often and start to go to more distilleries, it really blows my mind how varied even just the white lightning that comes off the stills are. You think of the unaged whiskey as not really having a ton of character in and of itself. And if you don't drink a lot of whiskey, you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference. Honestly, you could probably tell some differences in major mash bill differences, but if you don't drink a lot of whiskey and try a lot of different whiskey, it might be hard to tell those differences. But the more that I go into Kentucky and the more I try all of these different unaged expressions, they're vastly different. They're just as different as the whiskey, and what comes off the still is just got its own level of variety that's so interesting. So the fact that you're talking about giving the attention to the undistilled whiskey and making the undistilled whiskey better and better to consume, I'd imagine that's just got to translate to an even better barreled expression too, because
that's the point. Yeah, because it's like the old computer thing: garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah,
if you don't have clean, good fermentation, you're not going to make up for it on the back end.
Yeah,
you got to do good, clean fermentation, and then secondly, that distillation and the cuts on the still have to be made right, or you're going to not be able to make in the end that aged product you want. So in our whiskey, when it's coming off the still, I've found that I'll taste it at like 120 when we're doing finish runs. It's sweet. It's at that proof. It's, sometimes I wish I could bottle it at that proof. And it only stays there for a while, because the still's running and that proof's going to gradually go down as you go through the day. Yeah. But there are certain sweet spots, and that's what's been fun too as we've gotten better, is to, after we're into the hearts, to go over there and go, okay, I'm going to check it right now and see what it's like. And then, an hour later, you put your little bit of cup in there and take a little more. And you're just understanding how your spirit is run through that still. The other factor we have is that every still, we have 5 of them and they're different sizes. Everyone has their own personality. So, we end up blending all that together, but it's interesting. You'll go down one day and we name all the stills. So, we've got Helen, Jane, Maggie, Ann, and Elizabeth. And you'll go one day and Elizabeth's like tasting great. And then 2 days later, she's not tasting good, but Maggie's doing real good. And, in an 18th century distillery, I can't tell you what variable happened. I don't know. I can't control all that.
Yeah.
And it harkens back, like you asked earlier, about learning to do an 18th century distillation. It transports you back in time and makes me think about, okay, in 1780s, 90s, they were experiencing the same thing. They had 3 stills, maybe 4, and a bigger distillery, and they probably had these things going on where they're like, well, I don't know why that's like that today, but it's marketable. The main thing is it was merchantable, Yeah. Because, but I also know, I asked Bill Lumsden once of Glenmore and G, I asked him, what does Scotch taste like in the 18th century? And his reply was, it probably wasn't very good. Because distillation back then wasn't about profiles like today.
Yeah.
They were trying to get whiskey to market. And it doesn't mean that some of it wasn't probably good. They were probably very quality people, but there was also stuff where You can read about them doctoring barrels up in every country to make it taste better. The rectifiers, you know.
Well, there's also there's also something to be said about the fact that, whiskey way back in the day, you didn't have a ton of options. You got it where you got it. Most of the time, it actually had to be a bit of a local source, and so you kind of just took what you could get at a point. And it wasn't until a little bit later that real commercial distilleries started opening and expanding their distribution.
Yeah.
So, at a point, you kind of had to take what you could get. And as whiskey expanded and became more marketable and more distributed, people had to go, oh, I got to produce something that's got to produce something better than the guy a couple towns over, because now he can get his whiskey over here.
Yeah, and that's where those brands develop, right? And the pride of the brand and the marketing of the brand, like Old Forester, and the early ones that you can see those early labels, which are fun to look at, or see the early illustrations in the marketing they did.
Yeah.
But in our time period for Washington, people often ask, well, what did his bottles look like? Well, you know this, they didn't bottle whiskey in the 18th century. It was casks. Yeah. So it went into town in casks. Secondly, it wasn't stamped with George Washington whiskey on it. It was simply common whiskey that went to town. But if you own a tavern, that's where he sold a lot of it to businessmen in Alexandria. And people come in to buy whiskey. I'm sure someone said, this came from General Washington's estate. Because that would have been that barkeep or that tavern owner selling that product to push it, out. So, because Washington, at that point, as you can imagine, he was the founder. I mean, he was the key man for the revolution and the first president. So that name meant quality and honesty, and still does today. And so that's a part that I'm sure those tavern and barkeeps utilize that to their advantage to move that whiskey.
I mean, I would.
No doubt.
But so that's super cool, man. Just it's just so weird to drink this and think, okay, this is made using the exact same techniques that were around when Washington was around, and it's interesting when you see something like this. And I really haven't had a historic whiskey like this before, but it really connects you. There's something, and I'm writing a book right now, and one of the things that I talk about is how we have this desire to connect with our roots, and we have this desire to have longevity, to be a part of something way bigger than we are as individuals. And whiskey is that connector. Trying a brand that's been around forever, or a whiskey that's been aged so long. If you're trying a 10-year whiskey, you look back what you were doing a decade ago, and it was just a different world. Every 10 years or so, it's just a different world, and it lets you connect into that timeline. But when looking at something like this, established 1797, using those same, using the same distillation methods, the same recipes, even down to, the label itself, looking so regal and historic in and of it, which you guys did a phenomenal job with the label, by the way. But looking into that, it's just kind of a different level of that connection. It really amplifies that to 10. Looking at something like this and really feeling that connection with American history and heritage. It's kind of a cool experience.
Well, I think the distillery at Mount Vernon has opened a lot of doors for people in that way that you described, because the whiskey lovers come. But it's also connected a lot of people in the industry to the past of whiskey. A lot of these distillers that work with us, or people that visit, they love it. I mean, I remember when we made single malt whiskey in 2012 with Bill Lumsden, who I mentioned, and Andy Cant, who was at Cardew at that time. He's retired now, and John Campbell of Lefroy. And when they came over, we were a little daunted because we didn't know, these gentlemen, and Dave Pickerell was helping us with that project. And they fell in love with going back in time. And Bill said, things like this in Scotland don't exist anymore, but this is how my forefathers would have made whiskey in this manner. So they totally were immersed in it and loved it. And they got that connection you're talking about. And Bill told me that back at his home in Scotland, he still has the shoes that he wore in our distillery that he spilled mash on, and they sit by his fireplace. And for us in Virginia, me and my team, it's like one of those markers. We're like, wow, some guy like that thinks well enough of us in the project and has the memories of the project with us. So, like I said earlier, people are brought together by whiskey, and Mount Vernon's distillery and the estate as a whole, tends to do that over and over again. And so for me, I've had a ringside seat at it, which has been super special because you get to coordinate some of these projects, but also, we got some things lined up for the next 2 or 3 years, some specials we're going to do, and get you really excited again because I know we can bring in maybe some other people that haven't been in the building before to do something special. And through that, we get a product, we get the experience with them, we get good press about it usually because the story of Washington's distillery continues to garner a lot of attention. And then we get to meet some of these amazing distillers out there, and it adds to our base knowledge. So remember in 2017, we did our 10-year anniversary distillation, and Fred No came.
Really?
And Fred was hilarious because he's bucketing mash, right, out of a fermenter. And I overhear him say to Dave Pickerel, "There's no way my grandfather made as much whiskey as he claimed using methods like this." So he loved it. He stepped back in time. Of course, he rubbed it in too because I told him how many proof gallons we make in a year. And he goes, "That's a minute and a half at Jim Beam." I know, Fred. I know you're larger than we are. But fun times, that was a good one. We had a lot of press there. We had, Dave there. Dave passed away a couple of years ago, sadly. Yeah. But, that was the last time he worked with us in the building. Fred No, Lisa Wicker was there, Ted Huber. It was just a great time. And that whiskey will be released sometime. It's approaching 4 years old, and I'm thinking about doing a Madeira finish on some of it. Madeira was Washington's favorite drink, so we've done that before with single malt. So look for that coming out. It'll have a special label too, a 10th anniversary Mount Vernon distillery label.
Well, that is so cool. Well, Steve, I would just like to thank you for being on with us here at Whiskey Culture. It is really humbling to have somebody like yourself coming on and talking to us about the history of everything. I mean, it's just kind of it's cool having you on in a multifaceted way. A, you're a great guy. B, I mean, just the history behind what the knowledge that you have, not just about whiskey itself, but the history behind it and the heritage behind it. It lives on through you and through what you're doing. And just sharing that knowledge and that passion and that history with us, I just want to say thank you, my friend.
Well, it's an honor to be with you, and I'm glad you like the whiskey because there's always that moment of trepidation. Well, what if he doesn't like the whiskey? I'm glad you like it, and I hope people will come see us when times are better. And I also just want to say, check us out at mountvernon.org. And you can look through a lot of history there, a lot about the distillery as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for being with us, guys. George Washington's straight rye whiskey is what we reviewed today. You can get it on Mount Vernon's website. You can order it online. It is a drinkable part of history, which is super cool, something that you could take with you to your next bottle share and kind of I guarantee you nobody else is going to have something like that, so that's pretty nifty.
And keep in mind, Greg, we can only ship to within Virginia and DC. Yeah, we're hoping, as a lot of distilleries are, that we'll get that nationwide reach. But
well, then people have to come visit you.
I hope they will.
Well, guys, go visit Mount Vernon. Go see the history. Go get some whiskey.
Definitely.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, man. Thank you all for tuning in to Whiskey Wednesday and being here with us. We appreciate you guys, listeners, viewers, readers. Stay tuned. We'll post when the next Whiskey Wednesday will be, and we hope to see you then. Steve, thank you again so much.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.